The voice was so soft it almost disappeared beneath the final applause. André Rieu was about to thank the audience when he heard the whisper coming from the back of the concert hall in Nashville. It wasn't a loud request, not a shout. It was almost a reflex, as if someone was speaking against their own memory. André stopped. "Who said that?" he asked, leaning closer to the microphone. The audience murmured in confusion. Some laughed, thinking it was part of the show. Others kept clapping without realizing something had changed. Back there, an old man remained seated. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't standing. He only repeated with a trembling voice, "The rose." The woman beside him gripped his hand tightly. "Thaddeus, don't," she whispered. André squinted, trying to see past the stage lights. "Did you request this song?" he asked. The man nodded slowly. "Not for myself," he answered. "For someone who couldn't be here today." Silence filled the hall. André took a deep breath. "Can you sing?" he asked unexpectedly. A gasp went through the audience. "I used to sing," said the man, "before life asked me for silence." André took a step forward. "Then come." The orchestra froze. Production panicked. The assistant brought her hand to her earpiece. "Maestro, this isn't in the program." André didn't look at her. "Some songs don't ask for permission." He pointed to the back of the hall. "Bring him up here." As the man struggled to his feet, nobody in the audience yet knew that this whisper would completely change the end of that evening. Minutes before the concert was supposed to end, André Rieu already knew the night had been perfect. The orchestra was tuned. The audience had responded enthusiastically from the first note, and the concert hall pulsed with that quiet energy that only emerges when music and people come into harmony. From the stage, André observed the audience as the last chords rang out. Smiling faces, flowers being raised. Some were already standing to leave even before the official closing. He knew that moment well. It was always like this. The final ritual, the predictable goodbye. But that day something bothered him without clear reason. Maybe it was the way his eyes kept wandering to the last rows where the light barely reached. Maybe it was just fatigue, or maybe it was experience. Years on stage teach you when an evening isn't finished yet, even when everything points to the contrary. Backstage, Saffron followed the schedule carefully. The timing was exact. No extra numbers planned. Production was already preparing to break down. In the audience, Thaddeus remained seated. His hands rested on his lap, intertwined. Beside him, Cordelia observed the stage with a mixture of emotion and concern. They didn't normally sit this far back, but that evening Thaddeus had insisted. He said he wanted to hear everything from a distance. Each song seemed to penetrate him in a different way. At some, he closed his eyes. At others, he took deep breaths like someone preparing for something they don't yet know if they'll have the courage to do. When André thanked the audience and turned slightly toward the orchestra, Thaddeus felt the weight of time pressing on his chest. If not now, it would never be. He leaned slightly forward and let a whisper escape. Almost a request, almost a goodbye. A single phrase, a single song. And without knowing it, Thaddeus set something in motion at that exact moment that would change the end of that evening. Not just for him, but for everyone who was there. Saffron stood at the side of the stage with her clipboard, her eyes fixed on the clock. Everything was going according to plan. The lighting was perfectly adjusted. The sound had no interference, and the audience was exactly as enthusiastic as expected. She had done this dozens of times. Each concert followed its own rhythm, but the structure remained the same. Quillen, the violinist who had played with André for years, felt the energy of the evening. He knew his place in the orchestra, his role in the great machine that made each concert a success. Tonight everything had gone smoothly. Too smoothly, perhaps. There was something in the air he couldn't name. Elowen sat in the middle of the hall, 3 rows ahead of Thaddeus and Cordelia. She had waited months for this concert, had bought the ticket the day sales began. For her, this was more than entertainment. It was a moment to forget everything, to just listen and feel. When André lowered his violin and the last note died away, the applause began. It was warm, sincere, the kind of applause that says the evening was successful. Elowen stood up, ready to leave, but something held her back. A feeling that the evening wasn't finished yet. Thaddeus felt his heart pounding. Cordelia looked at him with that look she'd had for 52 years, that look that said she knew what he was thinking before he said it. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Thaddeus shook his head. "I must." And then he let the words escape, so soft that even Cordelia barely heard them. The rose. It was a name, a memory, a request that weighed heavier than all the years behind it. Thaddeus hadn't planned to ask for anything that evening. The idea wasn't even logical to himself. During the drive to the concert hall, he repeated silently that he would only listen as he always did. Sit, listen, preserve what memories remained, and leave quietly. But plans don't always survive when the music begins. From the first song, something opened inside him. It wasn't joy, it was recognition. Every note seemed to pull at an old thread, those threads that remain hidden for years, waiting for a moment of inattention to come loose. Cordelia noticed immediately. The way Thaddeus breathed had changed. His hands, normally firm despite his age, trembled slightly on his lap. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Thaddeus nodded but didn't answer. He didn't want to explain. He wouldn't know how. They sat in the last rows, not by chance. Thaddeus didn't want to be seen, didn't want to draw attention. That evening was too intimate to share with the world. When André led the orchestra in a soft melody, Thaddeus closed his eyes. Then the image came back with force. A small room, decades ago. A young voice, uncertain, singing softly. A song that spoke of love, loss, and hope. The Rose. It wasn't just a song. It was a milestone. The last time he had heard that song live was before everything changed. Before the silence, before the absence. "Thaddeus," Cordelia murmured, noticing the sudden shine in his eyes. He took a deep breath. "If I don't ask now," he began, but stopped. "Ask what?" she asked. Thaddeus didn't answer because saying it out loud would make it too real. On stage, André felt that something wasn't closed. The orchestra followed the script, but his attention slipped beyond the first rows. Years of concerts had taught him that not all silence comes from respect. Some comes from expectation. When the last program number ended, applause began almost immediately. Strong, sincere, the kind of applause that says, "It was enough." It was at that moment that Thaddeus felt the weight of time. He leaned slightly forward. He didn't want to interrupt, didn't want to disturb. He just had to try. The voice came out softer than he imagined, loaded with something that wasn't courage, but necessity. "The Rose." Cordelia brought her hand to his arm. "Thaddeus, please." He didn't insist, didn't repeat it louder, didn't stand up, just stayed there expecting nothing and everything at the same time. On stage, André heard it. Not like you hear a request, but like you recognize something familiar. That word cut through the sound of applause in a different way. It didn't demand attention. It asked to be heard. He stopped. The orchestra found it strange. Saffron frowned backstage when she saw André wasn't following protocol. "Not yet," he muttered more to himself than to anyone else. André walked a few steps forward on stage, trying to locate the origin of the voice. The light made it difficult. The back of the hall was a sea of shadows. "Someone asked for a song," he said into the microphone. A murmur went through the audience. Thaddeus felt his heart accelerate. He didn't expect to be heard, much less called. "It's not for me," he whispered to Cordelia. "It's enough already." But something was already set in motion. Elowen turned her head, trying to see who had spoken. She saw only shadows, but felt the tension in the air change. Quillen carefully set down his violin and looked at André. This was new. In all those years, he had never experienced anything like this. Saffron pressed her earpiece, trying to contact the technical crew. "What's happening?" she whispered. André took another step forward, his hand above his eyes to block the light. "Who asked for the song?" he asked again, now slower. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't confusion, it was expectation. Thaddeus felt his heart beating too hard for someone his age. He hadn't planned to answer. Actually, he hoped everything would continue, that the moment would go unnoticed. Cordelia squeezed his hand. "You don't have to do this. Really." Thaddeus took a deep breath. His eyes were moist, but his voice came firm enough to be heard by those nearby. "It was me." A few heads turned. No more than curiosity. Nobody yet understood the magnitude of that moment. André tilted his head slightly as if confirming the sound. "Sir," he said carefully, pointing to the back of the hall. "Could you stand up?" Thaddeus hesitated. His body didn't respond like before. Standing required more than will. It required decision. Cordelia stood first, offering support. Thaddeus accepted. When he finally stood, modest applause arose somewhere in the hall, not of celebration but of encouragement. Saffron briefly closed her eyes backstage. "This isn't safe," she muttered to herself. "Bring a soft light to the back," André asked into the microphone. Slowly, the focus shifted slowly, revealing Thaddeus standing, supported by his wife. An ordinary man, simple jacket, white hair, nothing indicating why that evening now revolved around him. "What is your name?" André asked. Thaddeus, he answered. Thaddeus, André repeated. Why this song? The question wasn't invasive. It was respectful. Thaddeus swallowed. That answer wasn't prepared. He had never said it out loud. Because, he began but stopped. The audience was now completely silent. Because it was the last song I sang before I stopped singing, he concluded. A murmur went through the hall. André frowned slightly. Stopped singing? Thaddeus nodded. I used to sing, he said. Not on stages like this. In small places, hospitals, nursing homes, for those who needed to hear something other than their own fear. Cordelia squeezed his hand hard. And why did you stop? André asked softly. Thaddeus took a deep breath. The air seemed too heavy. Because one day my voice failed. I lost the person I sang for. Some faces in the audience touched each other. A collective sigh went through the hall. Backstage, Saffron tried to intervene. She only observed. André took a step back toward the orchestra. His musicians observed him attentively, ready for any signal. Thaddeus, he said, you know this song wasn't in the program. Thaddeus nodded. I know, that's why I whispered. André smiled slightly. Sometimes, he answered, whispers are the loudest requests. He made a gesture toward the side of the stage. Thaddeus, come up here. A shock went through the audience. Cordelia brought her hand to her mouth. André, he can't, Saffron began in the earpiece. André didn't answer. Slowly, he said into the microphone. We'll wait. Thaddeus took the first step toward the aisle, and at that moment, the concert definitively stopped being just a concert. Elowen felt tears stinging. She didn't know why, but something in that man, in his voice, in his story, touched something deep in her. Quillen picked up his violin again, his fingers tense. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he wanted to be ready. Saffron looked at her clipboard and then set it aside. Planning meant nothing anymore. The path to the stage seemed longer than it really was. Thaddeus walked slowly, supported by Cordelia, while the audience moved slightly aside to make room. There was no applause now. There was respect, a kind of rare, almost solemn silence. Each step brought memories he thought he had left behind. When he reached the side of the stage, an assistant quickly came forward with a chair. Thaddeus thanked with a brief gesture but didn't sit. Not yet. Sitting would mean accepting that he no longer had the strength to stand there. André came to him away from the microphone. If at any moment you want to stop, he said, we stop. Thaddeus nodded. I've waited a long time for this moment, he answered. I can wait a little longer. André placed his hand on his shoulder and led him to the center of the stage. The light now clearly revealed his face. Deep wrinkles, tired eyes, and something more. A presence that didn't ask for pity, only attention. This man, André said into the microphone, asked for a song that wasn't in the program, and sometimes that happens because the song is guarding someone. The audience remained in absolute silence. André turned to Thaddeus. You said you sang, he spoke carefully. Where? Thaddeus took a deep breath. Wherever they let me, he answered. Hospitals, homes, small rooms, places where people didn't ask for music, but needed it. Cordelia observed from the side, her hands trembling. I didn't sing to be heard, Thaddeus continued. I sang so someone wouldn't feel alone. André nodded slowly. And the rose, he asked. Thaddeus briefly closed his eyes. It was the first song I sang for her, he said, and the last. The word her echoed without needing explanation. She loved this song, Thaddeus continued. She said it was exactly about life. That sometimes everything seems closed, dry, without color, until something blooms when you least expect it. He opened his eyes and looked at the audience, but seemed to see only one person. When she got sick, I sang softly. My voice wasn't the same anymore. Sometimes the words failed, but she always smiled. A collective sigh went through the hall. On the last day, Thaddeus said with a soft voice, I sang. I stopped halfway and I never sang again after that. The silence was now heavy. André walked a few steps toward the orchestra, made a discreet gesture that they should remain waiting. Thaddeus, he said, turning back to him, you sing because you lost your voice. Thaddeus looked at him confused. You stopped because you lost someone. Thaddeus felt his legs weaken. André signaled for the chair. This time he sat. I thought, Thaddeus mumbled, that the music had gone with her. André crouched before him, coming to the same height. Music doesn't go away, he answered. It waits. André stood up and looked at the orchestra. Gentlemen, he said, we're going to play The Rose. A murmur went through the audience. Saffron closed her eyes backstage. The schedule was abandoned, but something bigger took over. André turned to Thaddeus. "You don't have to sing," he said. "Just stay here." Thaddeus slowly shook his head. "No," he answered. "If I don't try today, I'll never try again." André looked at him for a few seconds. Then he signaled to bring a low microphone, adjusted to the height of the chair. Then he said, "We'll sing together." The orchestra prepared. The first chord hadn't been played yet, and the entire hall held its breath, not knowing that this moment would be forever engraved in the memory of everyone who was there. Elowen felt her heart pounding. She had no idea who this man was, but his story touched something deep in her. She thought of her own grandfather, who had stopped playing his guitar after her grandmother's death. He had never played a note again. Quillen felt his eyes moisten. He wasn't ashamed of it. This was why he had gone into music, not for perfection, but for moments like this. Saffron completely let go of her clipboard. This was bigger than any protocol. André raised his hand, ready to lead the orchestra. But before he gave the signal, he leaned toward Thaddeus and whispered something only he could hear. Thaddeus nodded, his eyes closed, his hands clenched around the microphone as if it were a lifeline, and then the music began. The first notes were so tender they almost hurt. The orchestra played with a caution they had never applied before, as if they knew they weren't just playing music but carrying someone's life. Thaddeus opened his mouth. No sound came. His throat was squeezed shut by emotion. André sang the first line, his voice strong but soft, an invitation rather than a performance. At the second line, Thaddeus tried again. This time, a sound came, weak, broken, but real. Cordelia brought her hands to her face. Tears flowed freely. The audience didn't move. Nobody took out a phone. Nobody coughed. It was as if the whole world had fallen silent for a moment to listen to this one man. When Thaddeus reached the line that spoke of love growing in the dark, his voice faltered again. He stopped, his head bowed. "Sorry," he whispered. André placed his hand on his shoulder without stopping the music. "There's nothing to be sorry for," he said softly. "You're singing, that's enough." Thaddeus looked up, tears glistening in the stage light, and tried again. This time the words came easier, not stronger, not more beautiful, but more honest. He wasn't singing for the audience. He was singing for her, for the woman who could no longer listen but whom he still heard every day. The orchestra followed him, adapting to his tempo, his pauses, his emotion. They were no longer musicians performing a composition. They were witnesses to something sacred. When the song reached the bridge, something remarkable happened. Thaddeus's voice didn't get louder, but it did get clearer. The trembling didn't disappear, but changed from fear to determination. Elowen wiped away her tears, but they kept coming. She thought of all the times she had been afraid to let her voice be heard, to say what she wanted to say, to be who she wanted to be. Quillen played with closed eyes, his fingers moving from memory and feeling, not technique. Saffron realized she was witnessing the kind of moment she had started this job for, the kind of moment that made all the stress and chaos and long nights worthwhile. When the song approached the climax, the entire hall seemed to breathe as one organism. There was no more separation between stage and audience, between performer and spectator. There was only this moment, this song, this truth. Thaddeus sang the last line with a strength that came from a depth he didn't know still existed. It wasn't loud, but it was unwavering. And then the last note fell, and there was silence. Not the empty silence of ending, but the full silence of something complete. Nobody dared to applaud first. It almost felt like a violation to break the moment. But then one person began, slowly, thoughtfully. Others followed. Within seconds, the entire hall was on their feet. It wasn't applause for a performance. It was recognition of courage, of humanity, of the strength required to begin again. Thaddeus sat in the chair, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with tears he had held in for years. Cordelia ran onto the stage, all protocol forgotten, and wrapped her arms around him. André took a step back, giving them space, his own eyes not entirely dry, and somewhere in the audience, Elowen realized she had just witnessed something she would remember for the rest of her life, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. The applause continued, a slow, respectful wave of sound that filled the hall without overwhelming it. Thaddeus remained seated, Cordelia's arms around him, his face hidden against her shoulder as his body shook with emotion that had been bottled up too long. André stood at some distance, his violin loosely in his hand, observing but not directing. This was no longer his concert. It was something bigger. When the silence finally returned, Thaddeus struggled to stand. André immediately came forward. "Stay seated if you want," he said. But Thaddeus shook his head. I must stand. I've been sitting too long. With Cordelia's help, he rose, his legs trembling but holding. He turned toward the audience, his face still wet with tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for listening to someone who thought nobody wanted to hear anymore." A woman in the third row called out, "We hear you." Others agreed, their voices soft but urgent. Thaddeus smiled weakly. 52 years ago I sang on small stages. Nothing like this. I sang in hospitals for people too sick to go out. I sang in nursing homes for people who had forgotten their own names. I sang because—" He stopped, swallowed, "because my wife asked me to. She said my voice gave people comfort, even when the words weren't always perfect." Cordelia squeezed his hand. "When she got sick," Thaddeus continued, "I kept singing for her, only for her. Every evening beside her bed, I sang all the songs she loved, and The Rose was her favorite." He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on a point far away. "On her last day, she asked me to sing it one more time. I began, but halfway through, I couldn't continue. The words got stuck. She gripped my hand and said, 'It's okay. I've heard enough to remember.' The silence in the hall was absolute. She died that evening," Thaddeus said softly, "and I never sang a note again until tonight." André took a step forward. "Why tonight?" Thaddeus looked at him. "Because I heard her voice last night in my dream. She said, 'Stop waiting for permission to return to who you are.'" He laughed, a dry, broken sound. "I thought it was crazy talk, an old man hearing things. But then I came here, and I heard your music, and I realized—" "What?" André asked softly. "That she was right, that I didn't stop singing because I lost her. I stopped because I couldn't forgive myself for not finishing the song." Cordelia whispered something in his ear. Thaddeus nodded. "My wife would have been angry," he said to the audience. "She would have said, 'Thaddeus, stop being so dramatic, go sing.'" A light laugh went through the hall, tender and understanding. "So," Thaddeus said, "for her, and for everyone who thinks it's too late to begin again." He turned to André. "May I sing one more verse? Just me, without the orchestra, like I did in those small rooms." André hesitated, glanced at Saffron, who barely visibly nodded. "The stage is yours," André said. Thaddeus gripped the microphone more firmly, closed his eyes and began to sing. This time his voice was steadier. Not perfect, not trained, but unshakably honest. He sang about a rose growing in snow, about love that remains even when everything else is gone. He sang each line as if it were a prayer. Eloan felt something break in her chest, something that had been locked up for a long time. She thought of all the times she had been afraid to speak, to ask for what she wanted, to be who she was, and she realized that if this old man could find the courage to stand on a stage after 52 years of silence, she had no more excuses. Quillen set down his violin and applauded softly, his eyes closed. Saffron made notes she knew she would never read. This moment couldn't be captured in words. When Thaddeus sang the last note, he remained standing, his eyes still closed, his face turned toward the ceiling. "Thank you," he whispered. "I heard you." The audience understood he wasn't speaking to them. The applause that followed was different. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, it was deep, resonating, the kind of applause that comes from the soul. Thaddeus opened his eyes and looked around. "I didn't come here tonight expecting to sing. I came expecting to remember. But all of you, you gave me back something I thought was lost." He looked at André. "Thank you for listening when nobody else did." André smiled. "I did nothing. You did it all." "No," Thaddeus said. "You stopped. That's everything. You stopped and listened. Most people don't do that." He turned to the audience. "How many people here have a voice they're not using? How many of you have something to say but are waiting for permission?" A few heads nodded, eyes full of tears. "Stop waiting," Thaddeus said. "I waited 52 years. Don't be like me. Sing now, speak now, live now." Cordelia took his arm. "Time to go, dear." Thaddeus nodded. "Yes, but first," he turned to the orchestra. "Would you play something for me? Something joyful? I want this evening to end with joy, not with sadness." André laughed. "What do you suggest?" "Something people can dance to. Something that reminds them life is beautiful, even with all the pain." André thought for a moment, then turned to the orchestra. "The Danube," Thaddeus grinned. "Perfect." As the orchestra played the opening notes, Cordelia helped Thaddeus off the stage. But halfway down, he stopped, turned around, and bowed deeply to the audience. The applause that followed was explosive, full of joy and relief and something that felt like gratitude. Eloan stood, applauding, tears still flowing but with a smile on her face. Quillen played with an energy that hadn't been there before, his face radiant. Saffron dropped her clipboard and applauded, her professional distance completely abandoned. And as the music played, couples in the audience began to dance. Then one more, until the entire hall was moving in a joyful chaos nobody had foreseen. Thaddeus and Cordelia reached their seats, but didn't sit down. They danced slowly, carefully, their bodies moving to a rhythm they had both missed. "I love you," Thaddeus whispered. "I know," Cordelia said. "I've always known." On stage, André played with a smile on his face, knowing this concert, this moment, would be forever etched in his memory. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And at the end of the night, when everyone left, they didn't whisper about the music or the technique. They whispered about the old man who found the courage to return to himself, and about the maestro who stopped playing to listen. The first note came softly, almost shyly, as if the orchestra was afraid to break the silence dominating the hall. André led with careful gestures, letting the sound grow slowly, respecting the weight of that moment. Thaddeus held the microphone with both hands. He wasn't singing yet, just listening. His eyes were closed and his face showed a mixture of fear and recognition. It was as if he was meeting someone after many years, without knowing if he would still be remembered. As the melody progressed, André came closer and began to sing, low, controlled, like someone offering support and not playing the lead. The lyrics filled the space with delicacy, and the audience seemed to forget they were at a concert. This had become something intimate, almost private. Thaddeus took a deep breath. The first word came weak, almost inaudible. His voice failed at first, and he pulled back as if about to give up. Cordelia brought her hand to her chest, holding in the cry. André didn't interrupt, just maintained the rhythm. On the second attempt, Thaddeus's voice came out firmer, still vulnerable, still marked by time, but real. It wasn't the voice of someone trying to impress. It was the voice of someone trying to return. The audience didn't move. Nobody filmed, nobody coughed. Every person seemed to instinctively understand that this moment didn't belong to them. They were only allowed to witness. When Thaddeus reached the part that spoke of hope, his voice trembled again. He stopped. "Sorry," he mumbled. André came closer and placed his hand on his shoulder. "Don't ask for forgiveness," he said softly. "The music understands." Thaddeus nodded and continued. This time something changed. His voice didn't get stronger, but it did get more certain, as if fear had been replaced by acceptance. He wasn't trying to be who he once was. He was who he still was now. Some people in the audience cried openly. Others held the hands of those beside them. There wasn't pure sadness there. There was identification. Everyone seemed to hear their own story in that song. As the music approached the end, André reduced the gesture, letting the last chord last longer than normal. The sound slowly dissolved in the air. For a few seconds, nobody reacted. Then someone began to applaud. Not hard, not loud. A slow, respectful applause. Others joined. In moments, the entire hall was on their feet. Thaddeus tried to stand, but André gestured for him to remain seated. "Stay," he said. "This moment is yours." Thaddeus looked at the audience without really seeing it. His eyes were too full for that. "I thought," he said into the microphone, "that I had lost it." He took a deep breath. "But today I remembered who I was." The applause grew, but still maintained that different tone. It wasn't a celebration of performance. It was human recognition. Backstage, Saffron discreetly wiped her eyes. The schedule didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except what had happened there. André turned to Thaddeus. "The music didn't end," he said. "It just waited until you were ready." Thaddeus smiled for the first time that evening, and at that moment, everyone there knew this concert would never be remembered for the original program, but for something that was written nowhere. Eloan felt her heart full. She had no idea who this man was when she came that evening, but now she felt as if she knew his entire life. She realized that every person carried a story, a song waiting to be sung. Quillen wiped his eyes and grinned. This was why he had gone into music. Not for the perfection of notes, but for the perfection of moments like this. Saffron picked up her clipboard again, and then wrote just one line. "Tonight, we learned that the best concert isn't the most planned one." André helped Thaddeus stand. The old man stood unsteadily but with dignity. He turned to the audience and bowed, not as a performer but as someone who was grateful. 52 years, he said. 52 years I waited, and now I know why. Because this was the moment. This was when I was ready. He looked at Cordelia, who stood at the side of the stage, her face soaked with tears, but glowing with pride. "My wife would have been proud," Thaddeus said. "She would have said, 'Finally, Thaddeus. Finally, you stopped hiding.'" The hall laughed, a soft, warm laugh. André picked up his violin. "Thaddeus, would you like us to play one more song? Something of your choice?" Thaddeus thought for a moment. "Play something for all the people here who are afraid. Something that tells them it's never too late." André nodded. "I know exactly what." He turned to the orchestra and signaled. They began a soft, hopeful melody, a song that spoke of new beginnings and second chances. Thaddeus walked slowly off the stage, but halfway he stopped and turned around. "You know," he called to André, "I was scared tonight. Scared my voice would betray me. Scared nobody would listen. Scared it was too late." He smiled. "But now I understand. It's never too late to return to who you are. You just need to find the courage to whisper. The rest comes naturally." The applause that followed was a mixture of joy and affirmation. Thaddeus reached Cordelia, and they embraced, their bodies shaking with emotion. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "Me too," he said. "For the first time in 52 years, I'm proud of myself." As the music played, people in the audience began to lean toward each other, sharing whispers of their own stories, their own fears, their own dreams they had put off too long. Elowen turned to the stranger beside her. "I've always been afraid to paint. I thought I wasn't good enough." The stranger smiled. "Tonight taught me that being good enough doesn't matter. Being real is what counts." Throughout the hall, similar conversations took place. Strangers who were no longer strangers, connected by witnessing something extraordinary. Quillen played with his eyes closed, his heart full. He knew he would tell this story to his grandchildren, about the evening an old man taught them all what it means to be real. Saffron looked at her phone and saw dozens of missed calls from headquarters. She ignored them all. This moment was more important than any protocol. When the music ended, André stood before the audience. "Tonight," he said, "we planned a concert. But Thaddeus gave us something better. He gave us a memory, a lesson, a gift." He paused. "So when you go home tonight, ask yourself, what is my rose? What is the song I'm not singing, and why am I waiting?" The silence that followed was full of thought. "Don't wait 52 years like Thaddeus did," André continued. "Start tonight. Start now. Your voice deserves to be heard." The applause was loud now, full of energy and determination. Thaddeus and Cordelia left the hall hand in hand, but at the door, Thaddeus stopped and looked back. The stage was empty, but he could still hear the echo of his voice, the music he thought forever lost. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty space, "for waiting for me." And as they walked into the night, Thaddeus began to sing softly, his voice carrying in the wind, a promise that he would never stop again. The applause continued, longer than normal, with a quality that even the most experienced musicians in the orchestra had never heard before. It wasn't the kind of applause greeting a virtuoso performance. It was applause of recognition, of collective catharsis, of an audience realizing they had witnessed something that touched their own lives. Thaddeus remained seated in the center of the stage, carefully holding the microphone as if it was something precious that had just been returned after many years of missing. His eyes slowly scanned the audience. For the first time that evening, he didn't feel the urge to disappear. André waited, didn't speak immediately. He knew this final silence was also part of the music. When the applause began to diminish, he came closer again. "Thank you for trusting," he said, just for Thaddeus. Thaddeus nodded. "I thought," he answered, "that if I sang again the pain would come back too." He took a deep breath. "But today I understood that not singing hurt much more." André smiled slightly and turned to the audience. "Tonight," he said into the microphone, "it wasn't about perfection, it was about courage." Some people nodded silently, as if those words were directed straight at them. Cordelia slowly climbed onto the stage. André helped her approach Thaddeus. He gripped her hand firmly, as if saying without words, "I'm back." "Thank you," Cordelia said with a choked voice, "for listening to him when he no longer believed anyone would listen." André only bowed his head. "Sometimes," he answered, "you only need one song to remind someone of who they are." The orchestra remained silent. No grandiose closing, no planned encore. This was already enough. When Thaddeus finally stood to leave the stage, the audience again opened space. But now there was no curiosity. There was deep respect. Some people lightly touched his arm as he passed. Others just smiled. Backstage, Saffron approached André. "We've never had an ending like this," she said. "Fortunately," he answered, The best ones are never planned. Days later, Thaddeus began singing again. Not on big stages, not for crowds. He returned to where he had always sung, for people who needed to hear something other than silence. But now, when his voice failed, he didn't stop. He continued, because he had learned that music doesn't require strength, it requires truth. And every time he sang The Rose, he no longer thought only of what he had lost, but of what still bloomed. In that concert hall, many left transformed without knowing exactly why, but all took the same lesson with them. Never assume someone's story has ended just because they speak softly. Some voices don't shout, they wait to be heard, and that evening, thanks to a whisper and someone willing to listen, an entire life began to sing again. Elowen walked home that evening with a new sense of purpose. The next morning, she would pick up her brushes, the canvas that had sat unused in the corner for months. She would paint, not to be perfect, but to be real. Quillen called his father that evening. They hadn't really spoken in years, only superficial conversations about weather and work. "Dad," he said, "there's something I need to tell you, something I've put off too long." Saffron sat in her office, stared at her computer, and realized she didn't do this work for the schedules or perfect performances. She did it for moments like this, rare, unexpected moments of pure humanity. She began typing an email to her team. "Today we learned that the most important thing we can do isn't planning, but creating space. Space for the unexpected, space for stories that need to be told, space for people to find their voice." In the weeks that followed, Thaddeus's story and that evening began to spread, not through official channels or press releases, but through whispers, through people telling others about what they had seen, what they had felt. A local newspaper wanted an interview. Thaddeus refused at first, but Cordelia convinced him. "Your story isn't just yours," she said. "It belongs to everyone who's afraid to begin, who thinks it's too late." So he agreed. The journalist who came was young, barely 32, with a notebook and recorder. But as Thaddeus told his story, she stopped taking notes and just listened. "Why 52 years?" she asked when he was done. Thaddeus thought for a moment. "Because I thought I didn't deserve it, that without her the music wasn't real. And now I understand that the music was never hers. It was always mine. She just helped me see it." The article that appeared wasn't what the editor expected. It wasn't a sensational story or feel-good fluff. It was honest, raw, and resonated with thousands of readers. Letters began arriving, emails, messages on social media, people sharing their own stories of things they had stopped, dreams they had given up, voices they had silenced. One woman wrote, "I stopped playing piano after my divorce. I thought it would bring up memories too painful, but your story taught me that memories aren't the problem. Fear is. Today I played for the first time in 10 years. A man wrote, "I always wanted to write, but I thought I was too old, too inexperienced, not good enough. Your courage gave me permission to try. I started my first story today." Thaddeus read every letter, answered many. He felt a responsibility to continue, not just for himself, but for all these people who saw that if he could do it, they could too. André heard about the impact of that evening. He wasn't surprised. He had seen this kind of moment before, how one honest moment could mean more than 1,000 perfect performances. He called Thaddeus one afternoon. "I heard you're singing again," André said. "Yes," Thaddeus answered. "Not much, not loud, but I'm singing." "Would you like to return for another concert?" Thaddeus hesitated. "I don't know. That evening was special because it was spontaneous. I don't want to try to repeat it." "I'm not asking for repetition," André said. "I'm asking for continuity. Your story isn't finished. There are more people who need to hear it." Thaddeus thought about it for days. Finally, he agreed, but with conditions. "Not as a performer," he said, "as a witness. I want to be there to encourage people to find their own songs, not to listen to mine." "Perfect," André said. So they returned to that same hall 6 months later. But this time, Thaddeus wasn't in the audience. He stood beside André, not as a guest, but as a partner. And this time, when André asked if anyone wanted to share a song, 5 people stood up, then 10, then 20. The evening lasted hours, full of broken voices and imperfect notes and stories that had been silent too long, and it was beautiful. At the end, Thaddeus stood on stage, looking at all these people who had found the courage to begin, and he realized this had always been the purpose. Not that he would sing, but that he would help others find their voice. Cordelia sat in the audience, tears streaming, but with a smile that lit up her entire face. This was what her wife had meant. This was why she had always pushed Thaddeus to keep singing, even when he thought nobody was listening, because one voice can lead to another and another, until there's an entire hall full of people singing their truth. Years later, when Thaddeus finally died peacefully in his sleep with Cordelia beside him, hundreds of people came to his service. Not because he was famous, but because he had shown them it was never too late. And on his grave, beside his name and dates, stood one line: "He whispered when nobody was listening and taught the world to be quiet and hear." The evening after his funeral, André organized a special concert, not of his orchestra but of the people Thaddeus had inspired. They sang their songs, shared their stories, honored a man who had taught them that courage doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it's a whisper. And Elowin, who had now become a successful artist, painted a portrait of Thaddeus, not as he was in his final years, but as he was that evening, standing on stage, his face filled with tears and light, his mouth open in song. Under the painting she wrote, "The rose, for everyone waiting for permission to bloom." It now hangs in the lobby of that concert hall, a permanent reminder that the most beautiful moments aren't planned, they're whispered. And if we're lucky, there are people like André who stop to listen, and people like Thaddeus who find the courage to speak. And if we're even luckier, we're there to witness it, to learn from it, to find our own song. Because in the end, that's what music does. It reminds us we're alive, that we have a voice, that it's never too late to return to who we truly are. The legacy Thaddeus left wasn't measured in albums or awards. It was measured in the countless people who, after hearing his story, decided to take their own first steps back to themselves. Teachers who returned to painting, parents who picked up instruments they'd abandoned decades ago, elderly people in nursing homes who began singing again, remembering that their voices still mattered. A movement quietly began in Nashville, spreading to other cities across America. Whisper Nights, they were called. Monthly gatherings where anyone could share their song, their story, their truth. No judgment, no expectations of perfection, just space to be heard. Cordelia attended everyone in Nashville until she physically couldn't anymore. At 84, sitting in the front row with her walker beside her, she would smile and cry and applaud every single person who found the courage to stand. "Thaddeus would be so proud," she would tell people, "not of what he did, but of what you're all doing. He always said he was just the match. You're the fire." André incorporated whisper moments into his tours. No longer following rigid set lists, he would pause mid-concert and ask, who has a song they've been afraid to sing? The responses transformed his performances from polished spectacles into living, breathing experiences of shared humanity. Critics were divided. Some called it unprofessional, chaotic, a departure from classical music's dignity. Others recognized it as revolutionary, music returning to its roots as a communal expression rather than passive consumption. André didn't care about the critics. He cared about the 67-year-old man in Phoenix who sang for his late son, the 42-year-old woman in Boston who sang the lullaby her mother used to sing before Alzheimer's took her memories, the teenager in Seattle who sang about finding himself in a world that told him he was wrong. Quillen eventually left the orchestra to teach music, but he didn't teach technique or theory first. He taught courage. His first lesson was always the same. Play one note, just one. It doesn't matter if it's the right note. What matters is that you played it. His students flourished, not because they were technically superior, but because they played without fear. They understood that music wasn't about perfection, it was about expression. Saffron left concert production to start a non-profit, the Rose Foundation. Its mission was simple: create spaces where people could rediscover their creative voices. They funded community arts programs, provided instruments to schools, and most importantly, trained facilitators in the art of listening. "We live in a world obsessed with being heard," she would say in talks. But Thaddeus taught us something more important: the power of creating space to hear others. Elowin's painting of Thaddeus toured the country, displayed in galleries and community centers. Beneath it, a placard always included the full story of that evening. Visitors would stand before it for long minutes, many crying, many smiling, most leaving with a new determination. The painting's final home was decided by Cordelia before she died at 87. Not in a museum, she insisted, in a place where people are finding their voices. It now hangs in the main hall of the Rose Foundation's headquarters in Nashville, where every day people gather to sing, paint, write, dance, and reclaim the parts of themselves they thought were lost. On the 5-year anniversary of that evening, André organized a memorial concert, not for Thaddeus, he had died 2 years prior, but for everyone who had found their voice because of his courage. Over 300 people performed that night. Some sang, some played instruments, some simply spoke their truth. The concert lasted 7 hours, nobody left early. At midnight, as the final performer finished, André stood alone on stage. He didn't play his violin, he simply spoke. Thaddeus thought he was asking for one song that evening, but what he really asked for was permission to exist again, and in asking for himself, he gave permission to all of us. He paused, looking out at the audience. So I ask you now, what are you waiting for? What song is locked inside you? What voice have you silenced because you thought it wasn't good enough, wasn't important enough, wasn't worthy enough? The silence was profound. Thaddeus waited 52 years. Some of you have waited longer. Some of you are just beginning to wait. But tonight, let this be the night you stop waiting, because your voice, imperfect, uncertain, uniquely yours, is exactly what the world needs to hear. The applause that followed wasn't for André. It was a collective acknowledgement, a shared commitment, the sound of hundreds of people deciding in that moment to stop waiting. As people filed out into the Nashville night, something remarkable happened. Small groups formed on the sidewalk. Strangers asking strangers, "What's your rose? What have you stopped doing?" And in those conversations, under the streetlights, in the cool Tennessee air, more voices found their way back. A woman who hadn't danced since a car accident, left her with a limp, began moving to music only she could hear. A man who stopped writing poetry after his work, was ridiculed in college, pulled out his phone, and wrote his first lines in 15 years. 2 elderly friends who had sung in a church choir 40 years ago harmonized right there on the street, their voices weathered but beautiful. The local news covered it, not understanding what they were witnessing. "Bizarre concert after party," read one headline, but those who were there knew better. They weren't watching something bizarre, they were watching people come alive. In the years that followed, the phrase, "What's your rose?" entered the cultural lexicon. It appeared on social media, in self-help books, in therapy sessions. But those who knew the real story understood it wasn't a catchy phrase. It was a genuine question that demanded an honest answer. Cordelia, before she died, wrote one final letter. It was to be opened on what would have been Thaddeus's 90th birthday. The letter was read at the Rose Foundation by their current director, a former accountant who had quit his job at 55 to pursue sculpture after hearing Thaddeus's story. The letter said, "My dearest Thaddeus never wanted to be remembered as brave. He would tell you he was terrified that evening, that every note felt like it might be his last, that he almost ran from that stage a dozen times, but that's exactly why his story matters. Because courage isn't the absence of fear, it's singing while your voice shakes. It's standing when your legs want to give out, it's trying when everything in you says it's too late." Thaddeus gave up 52 years to fear, but he refused to give it one more day. And in that refusal, in that one whispered request, in those few imperfect notes, he reclaimed not just his own life, but offered a map for others to reclaim theirs. If you're reading this and you're waiting for the right time, the right circumstances, the right amount of courage, please know the right time is now. The right circumstances are whatever you're in, and the right amount of courage is whatever you can muster today, even if it's just a whisper. Your voice matters. Your song matters. You matter. Don't wait 52 years like my beautiful, stubborn husband did. Start today. Start now. Whisper if you must, but sing. Always, always sing. The room was silent when the reading finished. Then, spontaneously, everyone began to sing The Rose. Not in perfect harmony, not with trained voices, but with honest ones. Voices that shook and cracked and soared and stumbled. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Thaddeus and his wife smiled. Because they knew that the song doesn't end when the singer stops. It echoes, it spreads, it transforms. One voice becomes 2, becomes 1,000, becomes a chorus that never stops singing. And that evening in Nashville, when an 84-year-old man whispered a song title and a maestro stopped to listen, wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning that will never end. As long as there are people afraid to sing, there will be those who remember Thaddeus. And in remembering, they'll find the courage to whisper their own roses into existence, because that's what his story teaches us. It's never too late, you're never too old, your voice is never too broken to matter. You just have to be brave enough to let it be heard, even if it starts as nothing more than a whisper.